I said when you were coming or leaving a while ago that I'm down as the faculty presentation today. I need to do some explanation, and there was an asterisk that was supposed to be there. I'm faculty on Thursdays. I teach one class, and it's on Thursday, and I focus on that a good part of Thursday and some nights before that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I teach, and then give you a sample of what I teach. The class that I'm teaching this semester is Ministry 6303, which is from text to sermon. And the asterisk on the professor part, faculty part, is that I'm really a preacher. That's what I was trained to be, that's what I did before I came here, and that's where my heart continues to lie. I love what's done in the academic world. I could not have preached at the level that I was able to preach for our congregation if I had not had professors like we have here. And in fact, I've told the story before, my first preaching job was here in Austin, and that's how I got acquainted with this school. And some of the professors, Reid and McNichol and Worley, took me under their wing and helped nurture me through those first few years. And I'm always going to be indebted to that, and glad that I can in some way be trying to pay that back with what I do now. The class that I teach from text to sermon, the particular textbook that I use in this class is called The 4 Pages of the Sermon. It's one model, and I let the students know that it's only one model. But it helped me. In fact, I want to tell you 2 things about Lane. I'm going to digress for just a second. I am so thankful Lane was not in here. She was in the kitchen to hear Tamika speak. Because remember when she talked about Norris coming home a better guy after having me? I was afraid Lane was going to make me enroll. So don't let her know. She didn't hear it. So on the other side, though, the way that I ran across this textbook, 4 Pages of the Sermon by Paul Scott Wilson, is I was preaching at a town, Granbury, outside of Fort Worth, and periodically I would go over to the Divinity School at Texas Christian University and especially just browse their bookstore. And I was in there one day and picked up 4 Pages of the Sermon, looked through it, nah, I don't want that. And then I heard a student come in and pick it up, and he was telling somebody there that his homiletics professor said that this was the best book on preaching he had seen recently. So I went back and purchased it then. Started trying to use it, struggled through it, had some trouble with it, but when I started kind of getting a handle on it, Lane, as sweet as she is, and always supportive of me, said, I don't know what's happened to your preaching, but it sure stepped up a little in the past few months. And I had to say, well, it's because I've been reading this book. The approach that Wilson takes, and I think Alan was the first one I heard this from, that every sermon should have a word of judgment and a word of grace. You have said something like that, right? Yeah, okay. Maybe not that direct. Well, I thought it was from him, but I found out that Alan had, I guess, a dated relationship with Martin Luther. That came from Martin Luther. I didn't know he was that old, but anyway, I really took that to heart when I heard Alan saying that, and then I picked it up from Paul Scott Wilson that every sermon needs a word of judgment. It needs to end with a word of grace. And Wilson said one of the things that he had seen happening in preaching was that for many years through the 20th century, it had been a very linear, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you what I intended to say, and I'm going to tell you what I said. And it's just a linear approach. And then there was some challenge to that called narrative preaching, to where you were going to try to bring the people along with you to where they would come to the aha moment, but it wasn't linear. They had to be involved with it. Wilson says that was helpful, but it missed some things as well. And the way that he approached it, and I want to get some interaction here, the way that he approached it was he had this little mnemonic device that was, the tiny dog now is mine. The tiny dog now is mine. I know it should be is now mine, but he has it now is mine. Okay. The first T is text. You work from one text. I've been told that there were preachers in the past that, let me see, how was it put? Have Bible, we'll travel through it preaching. I get a theme and I'm going to pick up every passage that I can that goes with it. Well, Wilson challenges that. He says, let's have this one text that we focus on and give our attention to that text all week long. The second thing he says is you need one theme. And this goes along with something that a couple of other homiletics professors named Fred Craddock and Tom Long have developed as well. The way that Long puts it is that you need a focus statement and a function statement. You've got to have both in your sermon. You need to know what the focus is, that's the theme, and then you show how it functions. The way that Craddock put it was that you see what the text is saying and see what the text is doing. And you want, when you discover what the text is saying, to do the same thing that it's doing. Wilson draws all that together in his approach. In fact, I'm going to give you one example. When I first started reading Craddock on find out what the text is saying, find out what the text is doing. I was a young preacher down here at Hyde Park in Austin, and I was preaching out of Judges 19. I was preaching out of the Old Testament, and which was new for me. But anyway, preaching out of Judges 19, which is that horrible story about the Levite and his concubine, and I told the story. And I used the word rape, and that went over like the pork chop in the synagogue. It was tough. And all I was trying to do is, this is what it's saying, this is what it's doing, and it didn't go over well. Well, maybe I was young and naive and needed to tone some things down. I wasn't totally innocent. But that's what we need to do when we're approaching the text. So that's what I try to teach my students. All right. The tiny text and theme, doctrine. He says any text you come to may have several doctrines within it. Choose one of them. Don't try to hit all of them. Focus in on one of them and develop that one. The next time you come to this text a few years later, you can approach it from another doctrinal angle. So just get focused on that one doctrine. One need. What need does this text address? You want to focus that. And then the I is the image or a refrain. Try to get an image that you will be able to work into the entirety of the sermon, or a refrain, a phrase that you'll use over and over that helps people hear and listen. And then the last thing, M, is mine, is mission. And it's a call to the church to give one mission. Now, one thing Wilson said that he realized in his preaching, and as I started reading him and looked back into my preaching, is that we can really have a tendency to be moralistic. And the way that I define moralistic is that moralism is putting a burden on the congregation without showing God's grace working within us. In other words, it's ours that we have to do, but not showing that God is the one that empowers us to do that. So yes, we want to give the congregation a mission, but we only see it through the grace of God. All right, Wilson breaks it into 4 pages. Trouble in the world or sin in the world, or trouble in the Bible, sin in the Bible is page 1. Trouble in the world or sin in the world is page 2. Grace in the Bible is page 3. And grace in the world is page 4. Now you can mix those up, except you always end with a word of grace. You don't end with a word of judgment. That's going back to moralism. In fact, one of my students, Alan Ritchie, once told me after having taken the class, he said, the best thing I learned out of that model was, you're going to hell if you don't preach grace. So I thought I got it across, but anyway. Okay, this semester in our chapel, we're going through the 5 scrolls, and Ruth was the first one, and I always do the first chapel, and my text was the entirety of Ruth 1. So what I did was come down and focus it to a narrow text because I'm supposed to do it in 8 minutes. Typically I go double that, but I was supposed to try to do it in 8 minutes. So you really, to get 8 minutes, have to narrow it down to a tight text. Now, I've expanded this a little bit from what I did when I did it in chapel. I was probably 10 minutes. You're probably going to get about 15 minutes worth, but don't look at your watch. Don't hold me to that. I'm still a preacher. But I'm going to give you a sample of how this unfolds. Now, the text that I will be looking at, based on what Wilson says to approach it as, is Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. And the theme that I have is that God works behind the scenes, sometimes when we don't even see it. But primarily, God works behind the scenes. And that's what I'm going to be trying to focus on. So what Wilson is aiming for in his approach is that the sermon is unified. That you don't go off in all directions, but you stay unified. And I'm going to be trying to be unified around this theme of looking where God can be working and we don't even see it. The doctrine that I try to develop here, the Hebrew word for it is hesed. In fact, Woody's over here. We took Hebrew together many, many years ago. Woody and another friend and I would get together at my kitchen table. Wayne was asleep back in the bedroom because we were always doing this at about midnight, and she had to get up and go to work. But we loved working on the gutturals. Hesed, hesed. And she would hear us in there doing all that and thinking we were sick. But you didn't have to hear that. The need that I saw from this text is to have the eyes of compassion. And so be listening for that as I develop. The image is going to be sweet-smelling bread. And the mission is, let's join and support with compassion where we see God at work that sometimes we don't see. So I'm going to give you a sample of how I approach that in our homily class. The text for this afternoon, is Ruth chapter 1, verses 18 through 22. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And the her is Ruth. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. When I was a student at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas, SMU campus, I would be driving from Granbury and turning up Central Expressway and then turning onto Mockingbird Drive to get over to SMU. And one of the best parts, I was typically coming in early in the morning, was that there was a Mrs. Baird's Bakery. Right, a lot of you know it. Right there on the... And oh, that sweet smell. And then one of my Methodist friends at the seminary introduced me to La Madeleine's. I'd never heard of La Madeleine's. And got some of those sweet fresh rolls before we would go to class. So just the smell of bread and that sweetness in it. And Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter." In the Christian Bible, Ruth comes after Judges. And Judges ends by saying, everyone was doing what was right in their own mind and there was no king in Israel. It was a decadent time. It was not a good time. The Lord's covenant with Israel was in great disarray. Because when God established the covenant with Israel, what He was intending was that loving kindness and goodness and mercy and care for one another would dominate that. And we can think all the way back to when He established the covenant with Abraham and made that promise to Abraham, "I'm going to bless you and you will be a blessing to all nations." Covenant with loving kindness brings a responsibility that we are to follow. And now in Judges, these people living under God's covenant are living in a time of violence, a terrible time. It was every man for himself. And women in particular, as we read the end of Judges, were very vulnerable and were being abused. It was dangerous for them. But at the heart of God's covenant is loving kindness, compassion, care for one another. And God wanted His people to be like Him. And as we read the covenant, especially as it's talked about in Deuteronomy, God has a great concern for the poor and for those that are vulnerable. And Israel wasn't living up to their calling. And I find irony in this story. Naomi and her husband Elimelech had left the area of Bethlehem, which means bread, because there was a famine. They had gone into a pagan area called Moab and lived as migrants. Naomi had 2 boys. Things evidently were going well for the family. They were eating, unlike they were in Bethlehem. But then Elimelech dies, and her 2 sons die, although they've married Moabite women. And in that situation, Naomi finds herself empty, a foreigner. No hope for someone to marry her. So she says, I'm going back to Bethlehem, house of bread. Because she's heard that the famine's over and there is again sweet-smelling bread being baked in Bethlehem. She says, I'm going home. The daughter-in-laws say, we're going with you, and then finally one turns back, but Ruth says, I'm staying with you. And we hear the words of loving kindness coming out of this Moabite woman. She has been around a family that understands God's covenant relationship and the loving kindness, and she is expressing it as well to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and she travels with her. And then Naomi arrives. Can this be Naomi? You can just hear the whispers. Is this really Naomi? Now remember, she's been gone 10 or more years. I felt that being misrecognized and kind of identify with Naomi because a few weeks ago I was called a family from the church that I'd preached to here in Austin asking me to come for a pastoral visit because the lady was dying. Her daughters that I'd known when they were about this tall had called me, and I haven't seen them since they were about this tall. I had trouble finding the house, so I called them, give me direction. They said, we'll send one out to be on the curb waiting for you. I pull around, get out, walk up, and she goes, are you Stan? And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, I was told to be looking for a slim, red-headed guy. Okay, Naomi, I know what you mean. Call me bitter. So they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Don't call them pleasant, but call them bitter. All we have to do is turn on the news reports. I was listening to public radio recently, and they were talking, this was about 2 months ago, talking about some of the refugees out of Syria trying to make their way across the Aegean Sea. Flimsy boats capsized, like over 100 died, many of them children. Fleeing from a desperate situation, migrants. Europe's not knowing what to do with all of these that are needing to find refuge. We hear about it every day. Wonder what can we do? I see the pictures of the refugee camps, and in fact, on radio this week, heard the report that, remember the young girls taken from their school in Africa, I forget which country, but taken from the school and haven't been heard from for, I guess, close to 2 years. The first thought was they would be turned into sex slaves. But this most recent report says they are possibly being used as suicide bombers. That they will drug them, get them drunk, whatever it takes, and send them out as suicide bombers. That's not loving kindness. That's not hesed. That's not mercy. And we see it in our world. We hear about those in the political debates going on now that want to build a wall across our southern border. And how do we look at those who are migrants that we call illegal aliens wanting to come into our country? And I'm not here to talk to political. This is above my pay grade to try to take care of that problem, because I know that we have a problem. But it's very easy for me to think of those illegal aliens as less than human. Don't call them pleasant, call them bitter. And I think as a parent, if I were in the situations that some of them are in, would I not be wanting to find a better place for my children to be safe and to have a place that they could do better than they have the opportunity in their own country? And then a little closer to home. A few years ago, it was in Dallas, news report that there had been a terrible accident on a freeway. A man and 2 or 3 of his children had been killed in the accident, and the way the report goes, as usual, withholding names until next of kin are identified. Well, next of kin was a wife that had just had a baby in the hospital that was watching the news and recognized the car, knowing what had come. Don't call her pleasant, Naomi. Call her bitter. Her world had been turned upside down. Now, Naomi sort of blames God here, probably more than just sort of. The narrator doesn't comment on that, one way or the other. I think that's left to us to do the commentary and thoughts on that. And he's probably doing that to cause us to do that. But what I see when I read this text in the entire book of Ruth is God was at work even when Naomi did not see it. God's providence, His hesed, His loving kindness, His mercy was still at work even in those terrible circumstances that she was in. Because where that Israelite nation seemed to have fallen apart in covenant relationship, here in Bethlehem, you could smell the sweet smell of baking bread again. They were celebrating a harvest. As we know the story unfolds, Naomi sees to it that Ruth somehow gets acquainted with Boaz, and we find some things said. Because Naomi in 1:8 had said to her daughter-in-laws, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." And then in 2:20, Naomi says to Ruth, "Blessed be the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And then Boaz in 3:10 praises Ruth for her loving kindness. This illegal alien has come to understand God's grace and mercy and is living in that covenant relationship. And although Naomi thought that God had acted against her, she did not completely despair and lose hope. She says, "The Lord has considered His people and given them bread." So Naomi took the action. We see a lot of action here. And this is one thing that we see about God's providence, about that loving kindness, is yes, He provides it, but we have to be active in it. We are called to be a part of it. And by the end of the story, Bethlehem is just full of that aroma. Bread everywhere. And the Lord's blessing and loving kindness upon Naomi came at the hands of a migrant. And we see as the story ends that David's line comes from Ruth. And we go to the genealogy in Matthew and see that the line of Jesus is through Ruth as well. And we see God's loving kindness continue to work. So God, as He worked for Naomi and for Ruth, even when they didn't see it, I think does the same for us if we will have eyes to see it. We can be assertive in seeking the loving kindness of God because He's poured it into our hearts and into our lives. A few days after I first did this as a chapel homily here, I was sitting at the Brentwood Church and we'd come to the table. And I thought, aha, bread. Sweet smell of bread on the Lord's table. And when Jesus took that bread that evening and broke it, said, this is my body broken for you. That's loving kindness. That's God's grace completely at work. And we are called together around that table to participate in that meal so that His loving kindness continues to flow into the community that is at that table and from the community as it disperses from that table. It's where God redeems tragedy and anguish through another one born in Bethlehem that we find our hope. And there are times in our lives when the tears of tragedy can say us, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. But it's good to come back to a story like this to where we see that God works even in that tragedy. And we can again smell the sweetness of bread and taste it. So we, like Naomi, lament. He doesn't call us not to lament. He expects us to lament. Todd Hall put me onto an article. Oh, by the way, I'm going to digress again. Dr. Todd Hall. Todd got his PhD. So I forgot to announce that earlier. But one of the great things Todd does here is direct us to some good reading. He directed me to an article a few years ago by a man named Nicholas Wolterstorff. And the title of the article is Trumpets, Ashes, and Tears. And he says all three elements should be in every worship assembly. We come with trumpets. We have tasted God's grace and the blessing of that, and we are celebrating it. But we also come with ashes, because we recognize that we still fall short of His glory. And we come in confession and asking Him to continue to forgive us and bless us. And then finally, we sometimes come with tears. And every time we come together, is what Wolterstorff was saying, is there's somebody in our congregation that's blowing trumpets, but there's some putting on ashes, and there's some in tears and need to lament. And we need every element in that worship assembly. Ruth, to me, speaks to that. There's lamentation, there's confession in a way, and there's celebration. After hearing this bittersweet story, I think we believe that God's loving kindness is still at work even in us and in our churches, as imperfect as they are. And may we take this as a word of encouragement from the Lord to join that mission, that maybe our eyes will be open to see migrants in a different way than the political rhetoric is calling us to see them. And again, I know the answers are not easy. I'm not trying to make that statement. But we individually can look at the migrant on the street corner possibly in a different way than we are called to try to do that. May God bless us in the hearing of this text, and may it work in our hearts this week.